All right, welcome back. We're going to have one more session before we break for lunch. So there was a nice little segue from your comments in the last panel. Yes. So excited to talk about building decarbonization. Here with Robert Cooper, another Shadow Ventures portfolio company, Embue. He's the president, CEO, and founder. We also have Brett Webster, who is manager of carbon-free buildings at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And we have Ilene Mason, who's with Rethinking Power Management, founder and CEO. So I will turn it over to Robert Cooper.
Thanks very much, Ian, and hi everybody. Really glad to be at Shadow Summit. It's working out really well for us. Great conversations and introductions that we're getting. So let's just get right into it. There's actually a building kind of hiding behind the title slide there. And this is just sort of a reminder that the existing building challenge for decarbonization is a challenge. That is a beautiful building. It doesn't quite look like any other particular building either, so there's a lot of uniqueness around existing buildings, and that's actually one of the challenges. This building actually has a little bit of history. Embue is installed in that building. Ilene works very closely with the owner and manager of that property. It's in Boston, by the way. So there's a big problem where you can think of it as an opportunity in the decarbonization space. So big picture, as you probably have heard multiple times at this point, buildings are responsible for 39% of carbon emissions worldwide. Just to realize 28% of that is during operation, and about 11% of that is from construction and deconstruction. So a lot of what we're talking about is improving those buildings in that 28%. While also not really wanting to add a lot as during a decarbonization process in terms of the embodied carbon, that 11%. Now this is a huge challenge. It's also a huge opportunity. It's probably the biggest sort of increment in real estate and construction that we've probably ever seen. Worldwide, it's a $1.7 trillion a year opportunity. The challenging part is that today we retrofit worldwide less than 1% of buildings every year, and that has to rise to 4% every year. That's a massive increase. If we zero in on multifamily, which is what Brett and Ilene and myself tend to focus on, that itself, just in the US, is a $1.3 trillion retrofit problem over the next decade, 2 decades. And that's focused on those 20 million apartment units that are in medium or large multifamily buildings. So it's not easy, and I'll hand over to Ilene Mason. Ilene has been working in the field of sustainability for over 25 years, focusing on energy, solid waste, and communications. She started Rethinking Power Management in 2009 with a vision of reducing the impacts of climate change by working with clients that had an interest in this space but really needed help turning that interest into a reality. She's primarily worked in the area of affordable housing, but has also worked with state agencies, hospitals, schools, and other commercial entities. Ilene chairs the DOE Multifamily Steering Committee of the Better Buildings Challenge. She also is chair of the Decarbonize Existing Building Alliance. She holds a BS in Metallurgical Engineering from Lehigh University and an MBA from Babson University. Over to Ilene.
Wow, it's really daunting to see your picture like this big. So yeah, just a little bit, Rethinking Power Management. We are a sustainability consulting firm. What that means, out of Boston, what that means is that we work with people that own or manage either a lot of buildings or complex buildings and really try to help them reduce their energy footprint over time. So we really sit on the owner side of the table, working with them over time to look at how they're going to improve their footprint. So what I'd really like to focus on is this sort of change that's happening from energy efficiency as we look at reducing energy footprints, right? We've had this paradigm of we're going to go in, we're going to make buildings more energy efficient. And that's changing now from energy efficiency to decarbonization. And it seems like there is a lot of overlap there, but there's also a lot of disconnects. And what I'm going to do today, being on the owner side of the table, I'd really like to focus on what are some of the market issues that are coming up as we try to address this sort of decentralized market. So the first is, when you look at the ecosystem around energy efficiency, everything is relatively aligned. It's been in place for a long time. So policy and regulation and kind of financial entities are aligned around how do you improve efficiency. So the mandates work with efficiency program utility dollars, it works with building codes, all of that is aligned. When you start to look at decarbonization, that doesn't really happen. And what we're seeing is that sometimes the decarbonization mandates don't quite line up with building code issues, or if it's a goal for an entity, it doesn't line up. For example, we saw in Rhode Island where the goals for the state to reduce carbon emissions didn't line up with how the Public Utility Commission was mandating that the utilities spend their efficiency dollars. So because it wasn't as cost effective, when you look at big envelope improvements and you look at electrification, they're a lot more expensive. So it wasn't lining up with some of the mandates from the Public Utilities Commission. So that's a big area of disconnect. And I also think something that will come up a lot when you start looking across the country at prefabricated panel solutions, which is what somebody was talking about over here. Another big issue is the payback paradigm, is what we call it, what I call it. When you think about efficiency, what drives owners is that if you're reducing your energy consumption, you're saving money, and you can get utility dollars for it. And there's this sort of financial incentive for owners to spend money. There's an ROI associated with efficiency. That doesn't happen with decarbonization. Again, the kinds of interventions are much more expensive. And so where the money comes from and how owners are incentivized, what makes them want to spend money on decarbonization if the ROI is not there. And the issue there really is how the mandates are written. There's a lot of technology change that needs to happen. We're seeing evolution in heat pumps and different kinds of, energy recovery systems and those kinds of things. But they're really not mature for a lot of building styles. So for, who has a large building and wants to run miles and miles of refrigerant line through it? It just doesn't happen. And so looking for technology improvements and that continued evolution is something that needs to happen. And then I think that we've talked about the demand for workforce skills. I just want to point out another aspect of that, which is in multifamily during COVID, 50 to 60% turnover of staff during that time period. So that's a huge institutional knowledge that left the workforce. And now these entities are short-staffed. They don't have enough people to manage these projects. And also there are all new people coming in. So how do we train them? So I think there's this, again, this disconnect in this ecosystem that needs to grow around decarbonization. So why do we work in existing buildings? Because they're really critical for the environment. I mean, we have to deal with existing buildings. They've been the elephant in the room for a long time. New buildings are sexy and exciting to work on, but existing buildings are tough. And when you think about it, and you look at the statistics, in Boston, 85% of the buildings that are going to exist in 2050 exist now. And they are going to account for 92% of the emissions. If you look at that across the country, it's about 2/3 of the buildings that exist now are going to be around in 2050. So it's a massive, massive undertaking. And it means it's going to need massive capital infusion. Right now, that money is coming from public entities, like it will be coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, from state agencies. But really, how is that going to come? Because it's not going to be fundable through public monies. So where does that money come from? Again, one of those disconnects. And the last thing I want to say is sometimes it seems like it's easier to knock a building down and just rebuild it with passive house or whatever way you're going to build your building. But really, when you think about the embodied carbon that is part of that building, it really becomes not a carbon benefit to knock them down. We really want to try to work with existing buildings as much as possible. So lastly, I'd just like to talk about some of the challenges that we see in the market. So first of all, building interventions are really hard to scale, and I think these panelized solutions are a great start. They tend to be more applicable in new construction, I think, although Brett's going to talk about some in existing buildings. But it's really, again, think about the building that you saw at the beginning, compare that to the Empire State Building. How are you going to think about those two buildings plus the local library in your town, right? We're trying to do all of those kinds of building styles, so it's very difficult to scale solutions. We talked about technologies. I think this ROI payback model, that doesn't apply anymore, and we need time to develop these new financing opportunities. So whether that's, they call them compliance payments for, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. In Boston, they just enacted a mandated emissions cap for all buildings in Boston over 20,000 square feet. So it starts out in 2025 and it ratchets to 0 emissions by 2050. The state of Maryland just enacted one that's going to ratchet all buildings for the state down to 0 by 2045. New York has local law 97. I think the biggest opportunity I've seen is with the Boston mandate, which has a carbon, they call it a compliance payment. If you don't meet your carbon emissions, then you pay X amount of dollars, $234 per metric ton that you're emitting. I'm sorry, the penalty is $234 per kilogram of CO2e emitted over the limit. So that amounts to tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time you get to 0. And it's that stick that I think is going to drive investment in decarbonization in the Boston region, and I think that's going to be a model that may get carried through to other jurisdictions. The last thing I wanted to touch base on was this idea that technical information, as you look to decarbonize a building, you need a lot of expertise. You need mechanical engineers, you need structural engineers, envelope specialists. You usually are looking at an architect, depending on the complexity of the project, and you usually have a sustainability consultant, someone who can pull it all together, maybe a passive house consultant. It really takes a team to look at how to decarbonize a building over time. And it also takes a team on the construction side, which you've talked about, I think, in a lot of the different sessions. And pulling that expertise together is often difficult and left to the individual owners, and that can be a problem. So one of the things that Terrence talked about was this idea of congruent, what did he call it? Something congruence.
Yeah.
But that kind of concept, maybe that works well here as well. So anyway, that's those are my initial comments, and happy to talk about them more.
Thank you. And now switching over to Brett. Brett is a manager at Rocky Mountain Institute's Carbon-Free Buildings initiative. He's highly focused on demonstrating a very scalable model for zero carbon retrofits into primarily low-income multifamily. He also works on grid integrated buildings and communities, exploring how distributed energy resources can provide grid services as well as support increased renewable variable renewables on the grid. Before joining RMI, Brett worked at Energy Solutions, where among many things he did a lot of analysis work helping California to meet its aggressive carbon and climate goals. Prior to that, he spent 10 years as a contractor in residential new construction and remodeling, and also served as a mountaineering instructor. You're still a mountaineering instructor, aren't you? Yeah. He holds an MPP in Energy Systems and Policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and also a Certificate in Engineering and Business for Sustainability, also from Berkeley. And he's got a BS in Environmental Studies, a BA in Philosophy, both from UC Santa Cruz. Over to you.
Thanks, Robert. So I think I'm going to stand. I'm unfamiliar with the circle setup, but I think I'll be a little bit more comfortable. So great. So just a quick bit. Rocky Mountain Institute is a nonprofit. We've been around about 40 years, focused on the global clean energy transition. We currently have about 500 employees working in the US, China, India, and a bit in Africa as well. Within our carbon-free buildings team at RMI, we think that to address the 40% of emissions that comes from the building sector, we need buildings to be built out of low-embodied carbon materials that we've talked about some in these last couple of days. We need them to be efficient and properly ventilated. We need them to be all electric and with heating and cooling coming from low global warming potential refrigerants. We need them to be interactive with the grid in a way that they can support balancing supply and demand and increasing reliability of the power system as it shifts to more renewable energy, which is the last piece of the puzzle. So to bring our building stock into alignment with this sort of zero carbon recipe, we think we need to construct all new buildings to a zero carbon standard starting yesterday. We need to ensure that all appliance sales are electric, efficient, and grid interactive. And then the big piece that I'm focused on and that we're here to talk about is really on increasing the retrofit rate, as Robert mentioned, 4x, and having every one of those retrofits be aligned with this sort of zero carbon recipe, which amounts to about 4 million buildings a year, 4 million units a year in the US alone. So our Realize group at RMI was really formed to address this existing building challenge. And we don't think we're going to be able to meet that 4x increase with just an expansion of the business as usual approach. We think we need to fundamentally shift some of the ways that we organize and deliver building retrofits. And specifically, we think it needs to be a more industrialized approach where we're able to draw on the kinds of prefab and offsite construction techniques that were talked about in the previous panel and apply them to existing buildings to drive the kind of depth and scale that we need. So sometimes we make a service analogy when we think about this industrialized approach to retrofits. So if we think about the cell phone industry, and you imagine you walk into a cell phone store, and the provider asks you, oh, you'd like a phone, and what are all the pieces of hardware you want your phone to consist of? And then you custom select these pieces of hardware. They take that and custom assemble your phone with a set of subcontractors that they'll need to separately coordinate with and that is unique to your phone. And then they don't even actually know what your phone is going to cost because they're going to have to get quotes from all those subcontractors first. And then they'll ask you to select all the cell towers that you'd like to route your service through and the frequency of the signal you'd like to use. And you'll have to figure out your own financing to buy this phone. Like, it's crazy, right? We would not have seen the type of a market transformation we saw in these short 8 years, which are 2 photos from the Vatican. And so we think we need to draw on some of this inspiration from other industries and start thinking about building retrofits in a more productized way, and ideally as a service model type of format where the product, the maintenance, and the financing are all wrapped together. So this is our theory of, or the components of our theory of change within Realize, and it actually starts with something that's not on this slide, which is a detailed typology study. If we're going to address existing buildings, we really need to understand the characteristics of the building stock, the existing conditions that are out there. And so we need to do region and climate specific typology study where we gather this information about the existing conditions, and then we need to design customizable but standardized decarbonization packages that can be applied to those buildings. Once we have the packages, we can layer on standardized financing solutions that can deliver those packages, and then we can aggregate demand across buildings with similar characteristics so that the retrofit components can be built largely in factories and delivered by a workforce that can quickly adapt to these methods because it's just faster and easier, which I think is a case that folks have made from the prefab and offsite space. So the classic version of this sort of standardized retrofit package to a multifamily building, we draw a lot of inspiration from the Energy Sprong program in the Netherlands that has been quite successful in delivering deep energy retrofits in mass. So it consists of these super insulated and airtight exterior wall panels that are built to contain the insulation, air and water control membranes, as well as exterior cladding and new high-performance windows, all sort of built into the panel, and crucially delivered from the exterior so that occupants or residents can stay in place, that they don't need to vacate and find some other place to go. And then the on-site construction period is dramatically reduced because most of the work is occurring off-site. Once those go on to the building and dramatically drop the heating and cooling loads, the mechanical systems can be swapped out with these small, efficient, pre-packaged mechanicals that can deliver all the mechanical services in sort of a retrofit-ready package. And then where it makes sense, solar PV could be layered on to the roof system. But not every building needs the same package. And so this image is actually showing some results from a forthcoming report. Sorry that the map is blocking the text, but that where we analyzed the entire residential building stock in the US in partnership with the national labs to determine which decarbonization package needs to be applied where. And so what you can see is the pie chart in each state represents the percent of multifamily units that receive the packages shown in the lower right there. And so the first is no upgrade. The building can be left alone because it's either on its way or maybe it needs to be rebuilt. The second is an equipment-only swap out. The third, in the dark blue, is a conventional envelope, which by that we mean just a light touch envelope, so adding 1 inch of insulation around the exterior and putting low E storm windows over existing windows in addition to the equipment. The red shows the cases where we need the equipment plus the envelope to be brought to the 2021 IECC code performance levels, and then the green shows the FIAS package, which is where equipment would accompany an envelope retrofit that would be brought to passive house levels of performance. So a few takeaways from this work for me has been, it's only 11% of the multifamily units that don't need to be touched. There's over 20 million that need to be retrofitted, and there's over 11 million whose retrofit needs, where an envelope intervention needs to accompany the equipment swap out. And that 11 million units represents a massive innovation opportunity because there are not currently these types of envelope retrofit products on the market that can deliver these performance levels at scale. They're starting to come into play, but this is a huge opportunity in this space to really meet these goals, and it's got to happen in the next 10 years, basically, is the window we have left. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Brett. Yes, very good to quantify and provide detail on the level of challenge. So I'm Robert Cooper, co-founder and CEO at Embue. We created Embue starting in 2015 in the built environment space. Prior to that, I had a lot of experience in software, network, and high-performance computing, but I followed my sustainability passion and created Embue and made that transition. What we do, just one slide on this, is we're a smart building platform for multifamily. So we do monitoring, we do control, and we also do automation from the platform. We put, or at least our installers and our partners put IoT devices in literally every space and on every piece of major equipment in that building, whether it's the apartments, the common space, the garage, the basement, the boiler room, the rooftop. The primary value prop is reducing carbon emissions and energy costs. But we also empower the staff to really be able to control that building from their phone, which is kind of a game changer for them and boost their productivity. And of course, obviously, there's resident comfort and health and wellness benefits. We see a number of our customers, increasing number of our customers, taking the energy retrofit path, and some of them doing actual deep energy retrofits. So they're improving the building envelope. Often they're removing like a sleeve, a through-the-wall air conditioning unit, installing a central heat pump, VRF system. Many of them are retaining gas-fired hot water baseboard, which is often a good idea. I think it's going to be a transition through the next decade, 2 decades of how much we do that. But retaining that does allow you to potentially solve the winter peak problem. So as you electrify as many buildings as we need to electrify, you'll find that peak electricity usage now is happening in the winter. And having fossil fuels for those few days of the year could make a lot of sense from a policy perspective. What's Embue's role in that? So we do dual fuel control, so we can switch between that fossil fuel heat and electric heat based on cost, real-time carbon emissions, or signals from the grid. We do things like a lot of energy efficiency approaches that, for instance, we're built in buildings where if you open the window, we detect that and we can set the thermostat back. It's great to have operable windows, not so great to open them when it's 10 degrees out. We monitor and manage, all of the major electrical loads, and this allows us to be, a grid interactive building. More broadly, the role of smart building in sort of catalyzing these decarbonization pathways for buildings is twofold. It's before the retrofit and after the retrofit. You're not going to retrofit all your buildings tomorrow. Maybe you're going to retrofit them in 5 or 10 years. You've got a capital plan for how you're going to roll that out. It makes sense to carry out modest cost energy efficiency projects right now. And a lot of those are controls based, and that's where we can help immediately in a building. After the retrofit, that same building controls platform is going to monitor all of that HVAC equipment. It's also importantly going to monitor staff actions and resident actions. It's also going to shape power usage. So those are really 2 key things that are changing. When you use power is actually going to become more important than how much power you use. And resident and staff actions are actually integral in being able to maintain the energy efficiency that you've designed for that retrofit project, and also shape that energy use in ways that works with the grid. And the goal here is to make sure that this essentially new building meets both its carbon targets but also its financial targets, because that financing that's been done is predicated on lower energy spend post retrofit. I just want to finish with one slide that actually relates to kind of my first question, which is around these emerging state and local building performance standards. So we've heard about Local Law 97 in New York. You may have heard about BERDO in Boston and the recent new law in the Washington, D.C. area. This is a very useful resource from the Department of Energy. As you can see the web link down the bottom there. Allows you to look at a lot of these emerging standards that are either being passed or under discussion in a lot of areas of the country. So the good news about this is this is one impetus for people to get started on their decarbonization pathway. And I guess my first question is to Ilene. Can you tell us more about these kinds of standards and really how they are being adopted or being reviewed really by people that are your clients?
Yeah, so I think they're tremendously important. So I'll speak to what's happening in Boston and with our clients and what we're seeing across the board. So as I mentioned, and as Robert just said, BERDO 2.0 is the new mandate. It was adopted in 2021 for Boston. Previously, we had a mandated reporting ordinance, which I think is fairly more common across the country, where organizations have to report their energy use. But last year, now you have to not only report your energy use, but you have to have it verified by a third party. And then there are emission caps that, again, ratchet down in 5-year increments to 0 in 2050. But your compliance payments have to be paid every year. So if you're out of compliance, if you don't meet the emissions cap, you're fined every year. Those fines go into a fund that then helps to support decarbonization for low-income environmental justice communities. So what's happened is, because of the compliance payment, and you can call it a compliance payment, you can call it a carbon tax, you can call it whatever you want, but basically as owners start to look at having to pay the compliance payment versus and invest in someone else's building versus investing in their own building, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. So we're seeing a really big shift in how owners are thinking about how they spend their money, because all of a sudden it's their ROI, right? It has an ROI that it didn't have before, because they're avoiding these future costs. And what we're seeing in Boston is that the mandate was originated in Boston. Now Cambridge is about to enact something. Other large cities in Massachusetts are starting to look at it. So the importance of having it be successful is magnified, because if it fails here, if it really is a problem, then it's not going to get adopted in other places, and we need these kinds of regulations. So I think it's really important, which is why I started the Decarbonize Existing Buildings Alliance. The other thing I wanted to say, which just went out of my head, I don't remember, but the other thing that's important to remember as we look at decarbonizing is it's also a way to reduce the risk for your building. So if you have a tight building envelope, if you have a climate event, it allows your building to hold its heat or its cooling better, so that you can survive any kind of power outage for a longer period of time, and any kind of backup power that you need is also greatly reduced. It also reduces your exposure to utility cost volatility. So there are some other benefits to decarbonization besides avoiding compliance payments and environmental improvements.
Yeah, that's very important. I don't think people really know that, and needs to be more widely known. So Brett, where is the state of technology in being able to do what you showed on some of those slides there? What are you seeing when you're talking to vendors out there?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing some major gaps. And I think specifically some areas that are ripe for innovation in being able to deliver these kinds of retrofits are portfolio analytics. Like, we need ways to be able to assess buildings at a portfolio scale that is not hiring ESCO to go do site audit and build a custom energy model and come up with a custom solution that costs on the order of $50,000 a building. We need a way to be able to do that portfolio-wide for like a couple $1,000s a building. We also need ways to enhance digital workflows for design. So in doing the sort of overclad solution, not that that's the only solution, but having a really accurate way to scan an existing building, build a 3D model out of it, and then have that 3D model be able to do takeoffs into manufacturing files would be a huge help. And one of the things we've learned in trying to do some of this is that, you know, the current tools that we use in design, like Revit and other BIM tools, tend to want to rectilinearize everything. So they'll make straight lines out of everything. And existing buildings, especially, may not be square and plumb in the way that the program draws them. And so we really need to be able to adapt pretty precisely to the existing articulations and whatnot in facades. One other area I'll mention is just in cold climates, when we sort of assess the component loads that are really driving heating and cooling demand, infiltration, air leakage in the building is 2 to 3 times, has 2 to 3 times the impact, or 2 to 3 times the load as transmission through the walls. So the air sealing walls, roof, and floor. I mean, the air sealing problem is really one that is, I think, ripe for innovation to be able to address. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so Robert, now I have a question for you, which is, when we think about these huge challenges that lay out in front of us, what is the impact that the IRA is going to have on these sort of building decarbonization outlook?
Yeah, so obviously the IRA is very new, and it's not that people don't know what's in it. There's a huge amount of policy and analytic work that went into the IRA. I think it's more that people don't know how it's going to actually roll out into the market. So what we do know is there's a big chunk of it that's really tax policy. So it's either tax credits or tax deductions. The good news about that is it rolls out very quickly. In fact, some of those benefits are retroactive to the 2022 tax year. In our space, in the built environment space, generally a number of those tax credits are built on existing energy efficiency and renewable tax credits, but they've just really increased the amount of money that's available, increased the number of buildings and the kinds of owners that can be eligible for them, and also made some technical improvements in the targets around energy efficiency that make them more attainable. It used to be almost impossible for an existing building to get an energy efficiency tax deduction, even though those are really the buildings that you want to incentivize for this kind of stuff. So that's all good stuff. Another key one in there was really relevant to nonprofits. They've made it easier for entities that don't pay taxes to take advantage of essentially tax credits. So that's very good news on that front. If you look at the other side, what else is in the IRA relevant to buildings, I think a really big one actually is a relatively small piece of the pie, which is going into workforce training. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody's probably said at every session how much of a challenge that is. And then there's a lot of money around things like green bank funding and various other kinds of programs that is going to roll through the states. And so there's more ambiguity about how and when those will roll out. But I think the big incentive that's going to move quickly are those tax-related incentives. And I think, you can layer those with other kinds of things. So the combination of, if you're in the affordable housing space, low-income housing tax credits, plus some of these energy efficiency tax credits, are going to be very significant. In terms of applicability, a number of those tax credits are more generous and more available for market rate housing, which I think is a huge value as well. So I think a lot of us are feeling very positive about it, and we'll know much more in the next few months about how it's rolling out.
I was just going to add on to that a little bit. So the fact that it's more for market rate is really important because a lot of the innovation that's happening is in affordable housing, because that's where there's government money to help move some of these things and some of the pilot programs and early seed money. But being able to move the market, especially if you have condo associations where you have individual condo owners, I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. So opening it up to questions from the audience, and if we don't get any questions, we've got some questions for the audience, so I'll open it up first. Any questions? Yes?
What do you see the average amount of years the return on investment to decarbonize a building, an existing building?
The return on investment to decarbonize?
Like 5 years, because there's an expense to it, right?
Yeah, so the expense to decarbonize really depends on the building. And it can be from something that's at parity with replacing with like systems to hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, right? If you're really looking to decarbonize or to move to electric from a gas-fired boiler system in a large, it can be in a large complex, it can be millions of dollars. So I think the payback is difficult to assess, but I think it really is going to focus on how much you have to pay in compliance payments. I think it also, there's two different ways that you can look at decarbonizing. One is a deep energy retrofit, which is doing it all at once, right? We're going to get an infusion of cash and we're going to decarbonize this building. We're going to look at tightening the envelope. We're going to look at the mechanical systems and the ventilation systems. The other one is they call it zero over time. where you kind of take on some of the energy efficiency stuff and you start doing maybe partial electrification. And that's going to be a different kind of return. But in terms of return on investment, it's really not that kind of a calculation unless you have some kind of carbon tax associated with your emissions.
Yes.
So, I don't know if it's a question or observation. You made a sort of chart showing the pie charts of what kind of things were needed, and I noticed the more invasive or more expensive things were biased to the north, so it sounds like this is largely heat loss related. And then also I see a lot of underdevelopment or blank across, well, the north and the south in this chart in terms of development of standards. So how do you see that developing? It seems like there's a cost problem on the northern half of the country due to the
Well, yeah, it's a good point. I think cold climates are definitely where, I mean, because when we're talking about electrification, we're mostly talking about heating and water heating electrification, right? And so, I mean, and there's some other appliances like cooking that are important. But, so yeah, in cold climates, those are more pronounced, but it's also helps the cost effectiveness because you stand to save the most by addressing the envelope there, right? So I think that's why you see the envelope intervention skewed to colder climates, is just because that's where you get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of reducing loads by addressing the envelope. Does that get it?
Yeah, so a little bit, because there is more payback there because there's more energy use for more of the year to keep
Right, the payback gets better, but I agree with everything that Ilene said, that like if we frame this as a like, what am I gonna have to pay and is my ROI gonna be in the 2 to 5 year range, we're never gonna get there. We gotta do things where, because I mean, the other point I guess I just add on is that there's so much deferred maintenance in a lot of the existing building stock that when we talk about delivering a decarbonization package, it doesn't make sense to do that without also addressing the deferred maintenance, right? And so if we can time the decarb retrofit with the trigger event of a major rehab that they gotta do anyways to keep the building around, that can then, you can leverage a lot of incremental cost to help make the whole deal more cost effective.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Yep.
There's another question? Yes.
So, kind of a political comment, some other comments, some observations from me. I'm pleased that Nebraska's nowhere close to any of those dots. and the reason is, you know, it's sort of a policy question for you that I chose. What's the most likely path to achieve the results? Decarbonization is the path we're on. Government mandates or industry innovation. I have a definite opinion that you don't get there with government mandates, because I can demonstrate it in my market anytime the government mandates, it just makes it more expensive and it's done. So where's the discussion of those dots impacting housing affordability? Blows it out of the water. It is all about the money. People have to have a place that they can live. And in order for them to live there, they've got to afford it. And so that's nowhere in any of these conversations that I hear about, it's not ROI. Somebody's got to pay the bills. There isn't enough funny money in the world, which is where it happens today, to achieve these results. Major gaps in technology on the retrofits. Yet the government's mandating stuff? Why? What's the standard? Why would you mandate something until you have a way to solve it? And lastly, this makes my point about the IRA. I was wondering what that was. Inflation Reduction Act. What a misnomer. What a government cover-up on what they're really trying to accomplish with that. And here, all of the analysis I see of that. Here's government-mandated programs and solutions and tax credits in areas that aren't the most efficient way to solve the problem today. More solar, when we're dumping solar in the ground in a lot of places? I mean, come on. These are government-mandated solutions, which I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, so just speaking on the Inflation Reduction Act, so the amount of money that is needed, the amount of investments that's needed for this kind of decarbonization is probably a factor of, it's either 2 or 3 orders of magnitude larger than the amount of money that's being spent in the IRA. So the IRA is really catalytic, and it's also, I think, the parts of it that I've looked at are really results-based, not making, technology winner and loser choices. So it's really about, you will get incentivized to, reduce 20% or more of your energy efficiency. So I think there's a lot of thought that's gone into that. And I think a lot of the organizations like RMI, like Rewiring America is another one, have really thought about how this kind of change happens at a society level. How do people make the choice to, have, in our case, more efficient buildings, and how that happens, and how market forces get incentivized. So, as an example, the reason, we're seeing incredibly low solar energy costs, and the analysis is that market was jump-started by renewable energy tax credits probably 15 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
So I think there's some smart policy that's gone into that is trying to avoid mandating solutions, but is incentivizing outcomes.
And can I just-
The current policies do.
Can I build
Yeah, go
on
ahead,
just that for
Colleen.
one
Yeah.
second? So I think the way, again, having sat in on, some of the discussions around the mandates, I think they have been thoughtful in the way they're implementing them. So the reporting starts now. The reporting has been in place since 2015. So people have been reporting for a long time. And as they look at what the emissions caps are going to be, they don't start for another 5 years, and they start at a place where they're reasonable to get to, and they then ratchet down from there. But I think they have been really thoughtful about how they put that together. And in what they're talking about, they're also making sure that there's time for the market to innovate. They're providing, the state is providing, or the city is providing dollars for innovation and for exploration. I think of too many things at one time, and then one of them goes out of my head. But I do think that they're not in the business, and they're really trying to avoid having anyone pay a compliance payment. Their goal is to have everybody meet the emission standards, and so they're putting things in place to help make that happen. So it's not a punitive mandate. It actually is one that's trying to build a better and a better environmental.
So in my world,
Yeah.
the people that will pay the punitive tax are the smaller landlords, the
Right.
smaller people, they're not the scale that can afford or innovate. And those are the people that are renting to the affordable people in the communities. It's not the big complexes. And so all of those people, all of my clients that I dealt with for years, don't have any way to push back against these government mandates.
So we're just going to leave it there, but actually if you go to that website and click on those dots, there's a table, and the column in that table is the list of housing segments and building segments that are not subject to those mandates. And generally speaking, those are small buildings. In many cases, they're low-income buildings. So there is some thought that's gone into that. I think this is a process that everybody needs to engage in. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I
We're
think
going to
all
leave
good.
it.
That's how it
Okay.
starts when the camel puts the nose under the tent.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.